Hello, and it's that time again, and my name is Paul Waite, and this is Aspen Waite Media, and specifically it's Aspen Waite History, bringing you part 4 of our epic 8-part series about the birth of the English nation. And as usual, I'm joined by the great charismatic Viking whose beard is getting more and more Viking every day, second. The new father, very overprotective and loving, a bit mad actually. That is Callum Waite, Callum Paulson. And how are we today, Callum? And how is Evelyn?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you, chat. Evie is fine. She's upstairs with her mother. How are you?
Is she not studying quadratic equations or anything useful?
She has been this morning, but I thought I'd give her a little break. So she's drinking some milkies for a while.
I think what is quite remarkable, which shows how brilliantly intelligent the Waites are, that Evelyn's first ever spoken word was onomatopoeic, which is quite remarkable for a baby, actually. So,
I thought that.
yes. Anyway, so enough of this idle chit chat in a serious history program that we're supposed to be running. So,
Yeah.
set the scene. The year is 899. The great King Alfred has just died. And it's very interesting because if you actually look at how history is portrayed, particularly, for instance, on the Vikings and the Last Kingdom, which we make continued reference to, Bernard Cornwell's great books, it rather gives the appearance that when Alfred died, everything was quite smooth and harmonious, which in fact was far from the case. And it's also true to say that the two people we're particularly going to feature today, the remarkable lady called Æthelflæd, otherwise known as Lady of the Mercians, and her younger brother, Edward the Elder, are not largely written into history as much as they should. And in fact, Æthelflæd herself was deliberately written out of history by the Saxons themselves. So the Saxon chronicles are very silent about Æthelflæd's achievements, other than to acknowledge that she is Edward's sister. So it's very much downplayed her role. So Callum and I felt that this woman was so great that she was worthy of her own programme. But I think in order for us to bridge the gap from Alfred the Great, the programme we did last week in part 3, as I say, who died in 899, and the arrival of arguably the greatest king England has ever had, stands up to serious scrutiny, in my opinion, King Athelstan, who is the son of Edward the Elder. We basically cannot really talk about Æthelflæd without talking about Edward the Elder, so we will cover both. I think before Callum and I were discussing this yesterday, because we have actually decided that doing some planning and preparation is probably quite a good idea for running a successful programme, both of us being rather intense and OCD people. And we were having a discussion, actually, a serious discussion about who could lay claim to being the greatest English woman of all time. And I think actually, the candidates are actually quite modest, to be honest with you. I think there's no doubt that the most powerful English woman of all time was Victoria, who was the Queen of England for something like 68 years, I think it was, and was obviously Empress of India. At that time, Britain had the biggest empire seen before or since ever in the world. 1/3 of all the people in the world basically had the Queen as their queen, which is quite remarkable. But I think we both agree that Victoria in herself doesn't deserve. It was more she happened to be in the right place at the right time, rather than her doing anything to deserve being great. So I think actually the candidates are very, very modest, and I think probably on balance. I think we both agree, correct me if I'm wrong, that probably we decided on balance that the greatest English woman of all time was Elizabeth I. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you have to really.
Yeah. So obviously, but then We dredged all the way back as far as we could into pre-Roman times, and of course, as we discussed last week, Boadicea or Boudica is a person who's sort of revered. She has her own statue in London, but I think that's more for being a glorious failure and being perhaps someone who's, as I say, perceived with resistance and a refusal to bow to Roman pressure rather than anything she did that was truly great. Whereas Æthelflæd, I think, stands serious scrutiny and in many respects may be the only queen in history, maybe anywhere actually. That's an interesting one so if anyone has any views on that. So actually, it's interesting that in fact it was after her death that, funnily enough, the sort of successors of the Norman invaders in 1066 started writing about her. 12th century. It's a poem actually I meant to read out today, which is quite an interesting one. It was written by John of Malmesbury, I think it was, about Æthelflæd and her great courage, etc. So we're doing the programme today because we think this is a woman that deserves to be known, and we're going to tell it. We're going to tell the story, aren't we, Callum? And
Yeah.
we're talking about a little joke about having a statue, but who knows? I'm actually quite keen to resurrect some sort of Anglo-Saxon history into perhaps some of the things we are doing ourselves. So there we are. So
I know that there already is a statue of Æthelflæd. I believe it's in Gloucester.
Yeah, with somebody else though. It's with Athelstan, I think it is.
It might. Yeah, I think it is with their nephew. Yeah,
I think it's in Tamworth actually.
Okay. But I think what's really important for people to know is although we'll be talking about Edward the Elder and Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians today, and they were both undoubtedly great people, as was their father. But I think what makes Æthelflæd more unique and stand out far more is that obviously in those days, in Christian society especially, it was very, very hard for a woman to achieve the things that Æthelflæd did. And this is at a time where they were at constant war with the Vikings, with the Danes. We'll get onto this more in a bit, but Æthelflæd led armies into battle herself, was, at least as good a ruler in Mercia as her brother and her father was even in Wessex.
Yeah.
I mean, this was just an amazing woman in every way. She had the respect of everyone in Britain, not just in England, in Wales, Ireland, Scotland. Just an amazing woman, and she would have really been a fascinating person to meet in real life, I imagine.
Yeah, I think danger of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves there. So I think we're painting the scene. So Æthelflæd was born in the year 871. She was the eldest child of Alfred the Great, the eldest of 6. Edward the Elder was 4 years younger than her. Callum reliably informs me. And obviously in those days, as Callum says, it was a very, what's the word? Male-dominated society, that's the one. A male-dominated society.
Patriarchy.
Sorry?
The patriarchy.
That's the one, patriarchy, that's the word. Which obviously makes her achievements even greater, as Callum says. So when she was about 20, I think, she was married off, as was common in those days, to the King of Mercia, who was Æthelred, who's very much portrayed on The Last Kingdom as a very duplicitous, weak, sort of conniving sort of person that wasn't very loyal to his wife. What historians don't know, and this is because there's insufficient facts and insufficient detail in the chronicles, is that there is a school of thought that says that Mercia was in many respects a vassal kingdom of Wessex at this time. And there are historians who believe that Æthelflæd was effectively, you could say, her brother's enabler, rather than being a strong, independent ruler in her own right. So that's something that, to some extent, we'll never know. I think I probably have my own views on that, and we'll discuss that a bit later. So we have a situation where Edward the Elder. So we're going back to the bubbling pot, yes, which we didn't really cover. So when Alfred died, actually, there was a 2-year hiatus before Edward the Elder was actually dominant, where Alfred the Great's older brother had 2 sons when he died, and as we discussed last week, the brothers decided between themselves that the survivor would take all, effectively, which is why Alfred became the king, despite there being 2 surviving sons. When, of course, Alfred died, certainly, on any proven sort of line of right of succession, you could argue that the elder brother's eldest son should have taken over as king. Obviously, Alfred may have been a nice man or whatever he was, but he certainly was also a strong person who obviously wanted to build a dynasty. So Alfred did everything he could to make sure that Edward the Elder was lined up to succeed him as the king. But this was very much disputed by Æthelwulf, who again is portrayed in the Last Kingdom series as a drinky, sort of an alcoholic, isn't he, Callum? He's like an alcoholic, conniving. Sorry?
I think it's Æthelwold, isn't it?
Wolf, it is.
Æthelwulf, is it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure it's Æthelwulf. Anyway, so if anybody watching this wants to correct us, obviously at any time you can write into Aspenwaite and tell us that. But it doesn't really matter because we're talking about the same person, and we'll just discuss it. I think it's an F on the end, and he thinks it's a D. So the person called Æthelthing is effectively portrayed on The Last Kingdom as a duplicitous, weak, drinking, alcoholic sort of chap, which is probably is very unfair. I think he probably had every reason to be quite bitter, and is generally accepted that there was trouble between the different parts of the family during Alfred's time. So it wasn't Alfred may have been great, but it wasn't all smooth sailing, etc. And in fact, when Alfred died, Æthelwulf actually marched to Wimborne, which at that time was a very strategically important place, with Wessex very much divided into 2 parts, sort of, with the capital was in Winchester, and you sort of had the east of the kingdom and the west. And so Wimborne was very much sort of on the line in between the 2 parts, so it was strategically very important. And he sort of basically declared himself king there and had quite a degree of support, actually, mostly from nobles that had been dispossessed or diminished by Alfred. And so for a couple of years there was genuine civil war, I suppose, and no real outcome. And then ironically, Æthelwulf allied himself with the Danish Vikings, who ironically had become very concerned about the arrival of the Norse Vikings. So there was quite a situation there. So you actually had the Danish Vikings allying themselves with Saxons through fear of the Norwegian Vikings. And in fact, there was a great battle, and Callum might help me out with the name of it because I can't remember what it was, where actually Æthelwulf's side, including the Vikings, actually triumphed over the Edward the Elder Saxons, but a tremendous number of their side was slain, including Æthelwulf himself. So who knows what history would have done if that hadn't happened. So probably the show about Athelstan would never have taken place, quite possibly. But take it place it will, because the pretender to the throne was killed and Edward the Elder was left with unrivaled succession, let's call it that, and that's how it proved. So so just sort of carrying on before we bring Callum in. So effectively, just to sort of bring you people up to date, so we've got Æthelflæd having married the king of Mercia, and then it's not known for sure, but about 10 years after their marriage, it's believed that Æthelred himself became ill or diminished in some way. On The Last Kingdom, he's shown as having received a very serious head wound, isn't he? But of course, as one of the things that's a problem with watching drama is of course the Last Kingdom is historically inaccurate. So, for instance, it's got the chronology of Edward the Elder's wives all out of sync, and they've made drama out of the things, whereas in fact there wasn't really any.
Well, I think to be fair, this so much of history is ambiguous. I think part of the fun from the writer's point of view must be filling in the blanks in a way that they think is most entertaining for the viewer. And to be fair to them, I think most of the things that are set in stone in history, they obviously do follow. Anything that's ambiguous, they sort of have free reign over, don't they? Which must be quite fun from a writer's point of view.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, as you said, things like Æthelred taking a knock on the head, that was just, trying to make the best storyline possible in the show. All we know is that he went on sort of a decline a few years before his death, and then ultimately died, leaving Æthelred to rule.
Yeah, so just as we say, it's generally believed that Æthelflæd effectively became the ruler of Mercia somewhere around 902. That's generally what's considered. So effectively, she became the de facto ruler for about 9 years before she became the properly crowned ruler in 911. So that's what it's generally believed. And of course, when Æthelred actually died, the fact that Æthelflæd was I think unanimously chosen by the Witan to replace her husband was, as Callum says, a remarkable achievement in a patriarchal society where there was no precedent for such a thing taking place. And as Callum says, I think what's even more remarkable is how she then behaved. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting, which actually is covered quite well in the Last Kingdom, albeit, of course, in the Last Kingdom, Æthelflæd's supposed to be in love with Uhtred, and one of the things that Æthelflæd does in the Last Kingdom to show her commitment to the people of Mercia and how sincere she is in taking her duties as a woman very seriously is she basically takes a vow of chastity, which is actually true. So in real life, she actually did do this. And it's generally considered that after she had her only child, who was a daughter, Eilgifu, that she basically took a vow of chastity, and she did that because it was very important in the time that she demonstrated to her subjects, that she was chaste and so on and so forth. So it's quite interesting. So in terms of, we've got a situation where we've now got brother and sister ruling the two main kingdoms in England. So what had happened to the Vikings at this time, Callum?
Sorry, I need to fill in some facts for the viewers.
Okay.
So I did. It was Ethelwald. His name was Ethelwald.
Okay.
Alfred's nephew, who had a revolt against Edward. And the battle you were referring to was the Battle of the Holm.
That's right, yeah.
As you said, at the Battle of the Holm, even though they won, Ethelwald died, and so did King Eric, who was possibly the king of the East Anglian Danes. So bring on. So what was your question? What was happening with the Vikings? What was happening with the Vikings?
Well, it's interesting because obviously we left. In 899 we left it where obviously Alfred had this resounding victory. Had basically subjugated the Vikings. There was a period of quite a lot of peace, 20 years of peace, near peace. So basically, what happened when he died? I think we talked earlier about the fact that we had the Norwegian Vikings coming in, and they had their own agenda, perhaps, to the incumbent, mainly Danish Vikings. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important to mention that actually before Æthelred died, so Æthelred and Edward the Elder, before he was king, actually had very successful battles together. They had major roles in fighting off the Viking attacks in the 890s, and they fortified places like Worcester, very, very successfully. When Ethelred died, as you said, Æthelflæd was fully embraced. What her and Edward did very successfully together. I mentioned last week that that Alfred built a series of burhs. They took the defence of England very, very seriously. So they expanded all the burhs, they fortified them, and what they did very, very cleverly, rather than just sort of thinking, oh, if we have a treaty with these Danes, we'll hope they stick to it. What they did, they would build massive fortifications on the borders of every single Saxon Dane territory, and then they would leave an entire army there. So at any time, if on any border, if any of the Vikings tried to invade, there would be an entire army ready. And actually, it's really, really successful, because what we were talking about when Alfred was young, as we were talking about last week, the majority of the battles between the Saxons and the Vikings, the Saxons lost. Probably 8 out of 10. Whereas by this point, really, it's like 8 out of 10 battles the Saxons are winning. So in a short amount of time, sort of like 50, 60 years, the tables have really turned, and this is all thanks, obviously, to Alfred's brain and mind and planning, and then Edward and Æthelflæd were both brilliant in carrying this on. And I said, it's really it was a joint effort. As you said earlier, there's a lot of dispute whether, was Æthelflæd really Queen of Mercia and the sole ruler? Was she, was she more a puppet of Edward? As I said, there's a lot of disputes. What we do know is that all the coins in Mercia at the time were the same coins that were distributed in Wessex. So this would obviously point more to, maybe she was under overlordship of Edward, but there are several texts that refer to her as Queen of Mercia, and I think there are at least half of Britain at the time respected her and her power more than Edward's, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And I think just before I pass back to you, I think one thing that I think is really fascinating about this time and about this family in general is that there really is quite a lot of mystery about them. One thing that we can say for certain is that, the majority of them were absolutely great minds. Egbert, his grandson Alfred, and Æthelflæd, and Edward the Elder, they were all great people. I think what the problem is when you come to things like this and very powerful people, is it requires a lot of wisdom and maturity sometimes to be surrounded by people that are equally as great as you and not want to be perceived as the greatest one of all. I think this is where you have a lot of problems. So it's actually very hard to actually know what the truth of these matters were. You've got people like William of Malmesbury, who thinks that who says that Edward was basically the best king up until that point. He actually thinks that he was better than Alfred. Edward was very admired by medieval chroniclers. And he's quoted as saying that Edward might have been inferior to his father in the cultivation of letters.
Yes.
Incomparably more glorious in the power of his rule, which is really an amazing thing to say. As I said, I think we've got a case of Edward leaving Æthelflæd out of it a bit. I don't think Æthelflæd was too bothered by this, because she certainly cut her own path, and especially in the north of Britain, had much more renown. But yeah, I think also, without going too much off topic, I think Edward and Alfred, it seems like nowadays, had some disputes between them later on in Alfred's life, and I think there are some cases as well of Alfred actually downplaying Edward. And it's actually what I read that was quite interesting was there were some major battles that were won under Edward's rule later on in Alfred's life. And I don't know whether it was out of jealousy or resentment to his son, but he left them out of the Saxon Chronicle, which I think is really quite interesting.
Okay. Just to recap. So one of the things that's quite interesting that happened when Æthelflæd succeeded as effectively the Queen of Mercia is Wessex took over control of London, which until that point had been part of Mercia. And from what we know, Æthelflæd apparently appears to have acquiesced with that. So it's generally considered, I think, it was a bargain struck between brother and sister, and basically the brother said, "Look, you let me take over London, and I'll support you being the queen," sort of thing. I think the point you make about the coinage, I was reading this myself. I think the point about the coinage is actually quite defining. It's actually quite hard. I mean, obviously you've got bare facts. One of the things that's difficult about this period is the absence of absolute crystal clear facts, and probably the likelihoods we'll never know.
Sure.
What the truth is. The fact that I think the coins, as you say, of Mercia and Wessex said Edward Rex Anglorum or something like that. There are no reported coins that say Æthelflæd Regina Anglorum or Regina. I think Mercia was called Mercina in Saxon. That would probably point to Wessex being certainly the senior partner, shall we say. I think also, though, which was very interesting, he picked up on the wider British Isles point. I think there seems to be very little doubt that regardless of whether Mercia was supposed to be the junior partner to Wessex, she clearly achieved a number of successes, including victories and battles, off her own back. And I think I suspect, I think if I was writing a book about it, I suspect that probably, I think the way that Bernard Cornwall has captured her in The Last Kingdom is probably quite near the mark. Obviously, they start off as she started off as a daughter of Wessex, became the queen of Mercia, and then I think all the evidence would suggest she took that very, very seriously, and became very, very. Mercia, of course, had for a very long time, in fact, been the dominant state in England. So it was comparatively recently that Wessex had become the senior partner, and I think probably that what happened is Æthelflæd, maybe just because she couldn't help herself because she was an alpha woman or whatever, she definitely did the best she could, I think, for Mercia. And I think if we look at the geography of England at this time, Mercia, at the time of Æthelflæd's arrival on the scene, had become a diminished kingdom, and you had the 5 towns. I think the 5 towns controlled by the Vikings that all used to be in Mercia, Derby, Stafford, etc. Lichfield, I think, is one. And basically, what Æthelflæd did, I think, as her main mission for the rest of her life was to push Mercia's boundaries back. And of course, apart from anything else, if you were a poor little Mercian living in, I don't know, at the northern border of the smaller Mercia, it must have been very terrifying, because you were probably living in constant threat of the Danes coming over the hill and slaughtering you, etc. Yeah. So I don't know if you've got anything to chip in at that point.
Yeah, I mean, and this is what I'm saying about how both Edward and Æthelflæd were so successful in this period, because they did fortify their boundaries so much. And what they would do is they would conquer territories and fortify them, push back a bit more land, fortify it. So to give an example of how good Æthelflæd was, in just 917 alone, there were 3 separate invasions of different Viking armies, and all 3 of them failed, and that's all down to Æthelflæd. So Æthelflæd sent a massive army to Derby, and occupied the territory around it, and built a massive borough there. Basically, it made the place absolutely impenetrable. As I said, 3 massive separate Viking armies completely failed, basically completely wiped off the face of the earth, all because of how effective Æthelflæd was as a military commander. It's really interesting. Got several notable historians that describe her as a renowned, competent war leader from every single source we have of her. And what's very interesting as well is that there's one of the most reliable texts for Æthelflæd at the time is called the Three Fragments, and it was a text that wasn't written by Wessex or anybody in Wessex, and it recounts how in 918 she led an army of combined Scots, Mercians, and Northumbrian English against a Norse Viking leader called Ragnar at the Battle of Corbridge in Northumbria. And obviously, this is quite ambiguous, but I mean, the very fact that she obviously led a group of Scotsmen that the Scots would have been happy for her to lead along, and the Northumbrians all together, just goes to show that she must have commanded so much respect. To combine all those forces is amazing.
Yeah, I think going back to your point about the respect in which she was held outside of Wessex, it's quite interesting. If we one of the shows that we intend to do in the future is a history of the Welsh kings of the period. And there were three really dominant kings in Wales at the time. One of whom was Hywel Dda, who in fact is our direct paternal grandfather, about 33 times removed. And the three great Welsh kings all paid homage to Alfred. And it would appear that they then did so to Æthelflæd. And certainly what's interesting is the greatest historical evidence of Æthelflæd's achievements actually comes from the chronicles of the Welsh and the Irish more than it does from within. And as we say, it was only actually after her death, many years afterwards, where people started to take a lot of interest in her. And I think the Victorians did as well. So what we have is this... I said to Callum yesterday, one of the things that would be really, again, I guess we'll never know this, one of the things that would be wonderful to observe or to know is how actually, how active was she in these battles? Did she, if you go onto YouTube and you watch the now many programs about Æthelflæd that are available, they have this woman wearing this sort of goldy, bronzy helmet, with a chainmail over her head, etc. I mean, is that actually what she did, or was it more like Wellington at Waterloo, where she was sat on a horse, at the top of the hill watching her troops? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a hard one to answer. I think that she must have been able to handle herself to a certain extent. If that wasn't the case, then I don't think that her as an intelligent woman and her advisors would have let her get so close to such dangerous battles. I mean, she led every single battle that she went into, or that Mercia went into. She led it, and this isn't.
Yeah, but what does that mean, though? What does that mean? This is the point. What does leading mean?
Well, this is where I'm going with it. But so I think that you can definitely say she would have at least been able to handle herself to an extent. Now, I think personally, she must have at least got involved with the physicality aspect of it to a certain extent. I think that she must have. I don't see how she could have been witness to so many dozens of battles and never once been put in a situation where she would have to, kill or be killed. So that's my personal view. I think that she would have, probably wore, similar garb to what the male soldiers would have worn, but just made appropriate for her. She wouldn't have been able to carry as much heavy equipment, I'm sure, unless she was an extremely large woman. But I mean, there's never any mention of that. So I think she would have worn, thick leather armor, things like that. Maybe some chainmail. But she certainly would have known how to handle herself.
Yes, well, I suppose we'll never know, will we? I suppose in those days, the way they fought, it's probably unlikely that she was entirely like Wellington. So I suspect there was some element of getting your hands dirty.
I also think that the fact that so many warrior cultures, like the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, the Vikings themselves, and all of the Saxons, respected her so much, and these were warrior cultures. I think that one of the ways that she would have attained this respect would have been through some sort of, through, to a certain extent, through martial prowess of herself, as well as just her armies. I think that goes without saying. Great warriors respect other great warriors. They don't necessarily respect the greatest politicians and that, They respect power and might, yes, but in terms of individual respect, which she has masses of, it's often given by warriors to other great warriors, isn't it?
Yes.
So this is good proof.
What else do we know about any great sort of administration or the sort of non-battle side of her role? Have we got anything on that?
All we know is that she was a great politician in this respect. She didn't seem to ever ruffle anybody's feathers. I don't think there's any accounts of her sort of having a fallout with anyone, apart from maybe the Welsh. There is an account of how I think some Welsh people raided their borders or something at some point, and she sent an army into Wales and basically burnt a load of villages and and sort of sent all the Welsh running. Apart from that, I think that both her and Edward, as we were saying about Alfred and also about Egbert, they carried on his vision about wanting to make a more unified Britain. And they were both working towards that as well as their individual fame. So I think that they very, very consciously built themselves a very, very good reputation. Didn't have many disputes, didn't let themselves get too petty. Obviously, what's important to note is that Edward sent his son Athelstan to Mercia to live under Æthelflæd, and this would have been important for everyone for several reasons. Obviously, Edward was looking at the long game, and yet again, like his father, being very cerebral man, he was thinking, well, Athelstan's going to be loved by the people of Wessex because he was born in Wessex, because he's my son. But as he gets older, the people of Mercia will be far more likely to accept him as king if he grows up in Mercia, because obviously by the time he comes of age, they'll see him almost as a Mercian themselves, and they will have got to know him. Athelstan would have been taught as a young man, how to handle himself in court and things like that. So he would have been taught to, be charismatic and to get on, to be likable. So I think that's interesting to mention. And this set up obviously Athelstan then being such a successful king of all of the Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah, I think in the remaining 15 minutes or so of today's program, I think it's probably worth going back to Edward. So Edward the Elder actually remarkably had 14 children, which is quite something, by 3 separate wives. Again, in the Last Kingdom, the series shows him as having 2 wives, effectively, with the first wife being displaced by the second one, Athelstan being the son of the first wife and effectively becoming illegitimate in some respects. That's how, and in fact, in real life, we believe that some people disputed Athelstan's right to become the king because because of the stories, the political intrigue that took place about who got married where and in what place, and was it done properly and all this. But what actually happened properly in history is Edward's first wife actually died in about the same time as Alfred, actually, and of the 14 children, I think something like 6 of them were by the first wife, and then the lady who's shown as being properly married to Edward in the Last Kingdom is the second wife. And then I can't remember the name of wife three, but what's very interesting is he has 14 children. As you rightly say, Athelstan was in fact the eldest child, and then the people that succeeded him were all progeny of the third wife. So every single sibling of the middle wife all predeceased the likes of Eadred, who became king after Athelstan, for instance. So quite an interesting little setup there, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So Edward's third wife, just so you know, her name was Eadgifu, which is quite an interesting name. Eadgifu, and she was the daughter of Sieghelm, who was an ealdorman of Kent.
Yeah, and I think that was probably quite an important strategic alliance that Edward had there. I think so. I think it's quite interesting there in terms of the succession. So we got all these 14 children, most of whom died quite early on. Probably before they were 25 or so. I see what an interesting one. I noticed that one of the sons of the middle wife was drowned at sea. So that may be something to look up as a fact in later. Sorry?
Edwin, her name was.
No, the one who died at sea was a man.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it's a bloke called Edwin then.
So I think there's very little doubt. We're talking about whether Æthelflæd was genuinely a queen or was she more like a vassal overlord to Wessex. One thing which is I think no one disagrees about is they did definitely strategically ally, and their goals were common. So they were both fighting together against a common foe with a sort of a joined up strategy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would, and I think Æthelflæd was actually very clever, and maybe being a woman played to her strengths in this regard. I think a lot of men would maybe be too proud to relinquish London like she did. But Æthelflæd was looking at the big picture, and I think that she realised that she had such a rare opportunity as it was to be, Queen of Mercia, the overlord of Mercia as it was. And I think that she didn't really care about giving, London to Edward. I think what she had faith in herself that she would make Mercia great and forge a reputation that was at least as good as Edward's, and that's exactly what she did. So I think that's very interesting. I think again it goes to say a lot about the woman.
Yeah, and then I think I think it's quite interesting because as you've taken us sort of to the end of Æthelflæd's reign. She had this amazing couple of years, the last years of her life, really, where she was amazingly triumphant in a number of major battles, advanced across northern England, really, and Wales, with a number of spectacular victories. And then just really when she was really in the ascendant, and again, it was interesting. We were talking about Æthelwold. Now we can properly name him. Æthelwold, could easily have spoilt Edward the Elder's party. Who knows what would have happened if Æthelflæd had lived another 10 years? She had maybe, we won't know. She was arguably the number one. What do you call them? Battle lord or warlord in the whole of Britain, certainly by 918. I don't think there's any doubt of that. I think, no. And I think it's quite interesting. Again, if you look at the Last Kingdom, Æthelflæd is portrayed as this very strong, dutiful, professional, sort of resolute, brave queen. And Edward is portrayed as a bit of a buffoon, isn't he? He's a bit of a sort of vacillating idiot, and
Yeah.
you have the scenes where he's throwing all his men at a heavily fortified camp, and seeing decimation, and he's not listening to sense, whereas Æthelflæd is, she's the one. So Edward the Elder doesn't even turn up at the battle, and he turns up late, and so on and so forth. And that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but the fact that this is sort of survived despite the Anglo-Saxon chronicles clearly hugely favouring Edward the Elder over his sister is obviously quite interesting. And I think it'd be interesting to get your point on this. So it's very, very sad. So at the age of 48, which of course was well above the average age for a Saxon at those times, which was 35, as we discussed in the first show, I think. So right at the peak of her powers, just after one of her crowning victories and the recognition that went with that, she mysteriously died. There's no proper account of actually what it was that killed her. What I think is very interesting, though, Callum, going back to the point about how independent she was, I think one of the things which is a fact which tends to point towards more independence rather than less, is Æthelflæd had a daughter called Æthelgifu, who she totally lined up to succeed her. There was no opposition in Mercia to that, and in fact, when Æthelflæd died, Æthelgifu took over as Lady of the Mercians. And then, one thing I never liked this in history, and of course we don't know what led up to it, and of course the history books actually are silent about the aftermath of this. All we know is that shortly after Æthelflæd's death, Edward the Elder marches into Mercia, effectively captures Æthelgifu, puts her, we think, into an abbey, but he might have killed her for all we know. Probably unlikely. I don't think there seems to be much thought that he would have done that, but seems to be considered more likely that she's put into an abbey. And of course, he basically steals her crown, and then at that point, from then on, there is no doubt who the king is, and it's definitely Edward.
Yeah, I think what we were saying earlier about how the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle deliberately sort of, it doesn't mention Æthelflæd very much at all, and doesn't give her credit for all of the great things she did in her life. And I think around the time of her death, regardless of Edward's and his court's attempts to make sure that he was still seen as number one, I think the tide was turning, and that in Greater Britain, I think Æthelflæd was seen as number one. And I think this is evidenced, by a ridiculous amount of things. But one of the things that's definitely, important to mention is literally, I think, a couple of days before her death, she had such a successful campaign in Northumbria that all the Northumbrian king, the Northumbrian king, and the king of Daneland, both were going to succeed to her rule. They were both basically said, you defeated us time and time again. You're clearly better than us militaristically in terms of your brains and everything. And she'd also sort of wooed them, so to speak. And they both wanted actually her to be the queen. Now, she died before she could sign on the dotted line and make this all official, which is a real shame. What's important to mention is after she died, they never made any such offer to Edward.
No,
ever.
No. Well, obviously respect to him, wasn't it?
Yeah. So as I'm saying, I think there was the tides were turning. I think regardless of Edward's power over what was written in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, most of Britain was starting to see her as the big cheese, even over him. Whether it was through his choice or through the choice of his monks and his court, I think fear was rising, probably in Wessex, that Mercia was going to become the dominant place again, and that Æthelflæd being a very intelligent woman, it seemed like she had completely groomed her daughter to pick up right where she left off. Like a younger version of herself, with her whole life ahead of her, was probably maybe a bit of an intimidating prospect for all the men in Wessex. Who also, quite interesting to mention, is it seemed like the people of Wessex were a little bit more patriarchal than the people of Mercia, which I think was quite interesting. So Mercia had a history of, if kings died, the widow could become queen, whereas this actually wasn't the case in Wessex, and most of the time the wife of the king wasn't even seen as queen. She was like wife of the king, which I think is quite interesting to mention. But either way, I think that out of fear, that is why Edward marched into Mercia and took his niece, and he sent her off to a little monastery to worship God for the rest of her life. Poor girl.
Yeah, I don't think fear is the right word. I think ambition would be a better word. I mean, I think also, I mean, it's interesting to see whether there's anybody's written about this. I mean, it just seems to me, in talking about this, that if you think about who may have been a loser from Æthelflæd's triumphs, as you rightly say, she basically had achieved dominance over two notable kings, war chiefs. So you can't help but wonder whether Edward didn't have her poisoned or something. I haven't seen anything I haven't seen anything anywhere that suggests that, even as a remote possibility. Have you?
No. I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it? Me personally, I think that if that was the case, there would be more, at least some sort of theory out there of that. I think, Æthelflæd had a very, very tight, supportive network of people around her. Apparently her thanes absolutely worshipped her. Like, they almost saw her as like a goddess. I think somebody would have had some sort of inkling of it. I didn't know if maybe, and this ties back into earlier about whether you were asking me of whether she was a warrior herself or just a commander. Maybe this is some evidence that she was, a warrior hand to hand in her own right. I mean, at the time, she would have just won major battles, which obviously led on to these, the King of Northumbria and the King of the Danes basically saying, we want you now to be our queen, we submit. Maybe this is evidence that she picked up some sort of wound. Maybe it got infected, something like that. Maybe it was a head wound. Maybe she got a wound that was infected, and maybe years of battle took their toll on her. As you said, there's no mention of any sort of disease or anything like that. It just mentions, and the thing is, whatever it was, must have been quick, because she went from winning battles to dying very quickly.
Yes.
So it wasn't like she had a long, prolonged illness. You can't march around England on horseback if you're dying. You just can't do that. Obviously, it's too tiring. I just think it's too tiring. Not in the way that she was, not in the way that she would have been doing. It would have been too hard on her. So I think that her cause of death, it was something that came on very, very quickly. And I think that this is evidence more of some sort of injury rather than illness. Whether it was a head injury, as I said, or an infection. I said, you've got to remember, people have been very prone to infections in these days. If you got a nasty slash that at first seemed superficial and it got infected, unfortunately, there's a good chance you're going to die.
Yeah, and as we discussed before, I mean, 48 in itself was actually quite a ripe age in those days. Although once you got to the sort of age of 30, 35, I think the life expectancy was reasonably decent. And there are quite a few people living around this time, kings and things, who become 70, for instance. So, of course, we'll never know. So, I think the second greatest English lady of all time, Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, 871 to 919, is a person who deserves her place in the sun. A remarkable woman operating in a particularly difficult time in history, violent, plotting sort of culture, where the week didn't last 2 seconds, and you had to be incredibly resourceful. I think resourceful, intelligent, and strong and decisive to succeed. So the fact that a woman managed to do that, and I think maybe with something we'll talk about next week when we come on to Athelstan. Certainly, no doubt that without Æthelflæd, England would never have become a reality. So I think she also plays quite a big supporting role in England today becoming a country. Obviously, without her victories, again, and I suppose in many respects, regardless of whether she was more or less important than Edward the Elder, without her, Edward the Elder wouldn't have been able to become as powerful as he was by the time of his death. And certainly when it comes to getting on to next week with, as I say, maybe the greatest king ever of England, Athelstan, debate and discuss. The route to his great success was very much paved, not just by Æthelflæd, I think, but by the joint successes of Æthelflæd and Athelstan's father, Edward.
Yeah, definitely. As you said, it was a complete joint effort between the two of them. I don't think either of them would have been able to accomplish what they did without each other. I mean, for example, around Æthelflæd's death, the time of Æthelflæd's death, Edward at the time was conquering all the southern Danes. So all of southern Danelaw, Edward was conquering that. Now, I don't think Edward would have been able to concentrate on the southern Danes and conquer that if Æthelflæd obviously wasn't taking care of everyone in the north of England, making them all to submit to her, and vice versa. So they obviously, to an extent, had a good relationship. So I think Edward probably tried to throw his weight around a little bit, but I think on the whole they probably a good understanding between them as siblings. And I think one thing that's really nice, and it just goes to show how likable Æthelflæd is, in my opinion, even to this day, was she was so diplomatic, even in death. She chose to be buried at Gloucester Minster. Which was seen at the time. It might seem like like a random statement, but it was at the time. It was right on the border of Wessex and Mercia, and that she chose that place. It's believed because it showed the solidarity between the Mercians and the people of Wessex. The people of the Mercian royalty weren't usually buried there. They were buried, more into the heart of Mercia.
I'm sorry to butt in, but I think you'll find Æthelred was.
They both were.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Æthelred, but she could have chose not to be buried there if she.
I know, but I don't think it's that unusual that she chose to be buried at Gloucester myself.
Well, from what I've read about it anyway, it said that she understood that if she was buried where all the traditional rulers of Mercia were buried, it would almost be seen as a sign of defiance, maybe against Wessex. Would have ruffled some feathers. By choosing to be buried where, as you said, Æthelred was, in Gloucester, it was a sign of unity between the people of Wessex and the people of Mercia, which, as I said, in my opinion, shows that what sort of what a big person she was, and makes her very likable to me.
Right.
And I think it's also important to mention, just really quickly, that she was buried next to the bones of Saint Oswald, who were in Christian society were. These were religious relics of great power. They were, to the Christians, these were like, 10 times more valuable than gold. So the fact that she was buried next to the bones of a saint goes to show, how highly she was thought of by the people that placed her there.
So I tried to finish the programme there, but Callum wasn't letting me. I think it's quite a difficult job doing a program on. I think today's was the most challenging program we've done because, on the one hand, I think Æthelflæd is worthy of an accolade of probably the second greatest English woman of all time, but there is a dearth of huge amount of facts about her. So it does make it quite difficult to talk about her for a very long time. So I think you did a very good job today, Callum. So. Thank you ever so much, as usual, for your input. I think next week's going to be really good fun with Athelstan because, we're effectively talking about the first person that really was the King of the English. So we're going to have an almost complete 1 hour of complete victory after victory. Just as well there wasn't a World Cup in those days, because we probably would have lost to the Germans on penalties in 950 or something. So, damn football, eh? Anyway, so thanks for tuning in today. Thank you also for all the very positive feedback we've been getting about how much you like the interaction between the Viking and myself. We both try very hard to do our best. We're always learning all the time, so we're striving to do better and better programs. So we both wish you a lovely weekend. Hope the weather improves. And we'll see you next week with part 5, which will be about Æthelflæd, the first King of the English. Thank you. Bye.